Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really pivotal moment in British history, the beginning of the 20th century, when a few radical reforms completely changed the country and laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state.
So here's the big question, right? It's a real puzzle. The Liberal Party's whole brand for the longest time was laissez-faire. The government should interfere as little as possible. So how on earth did they become the ones to start building this massive system of state intervention? Let's dig in and see if we can figure it out.
To get to the bottom of it, we're going to break it down into 5 parts. We'll start with Britain's status as a tarnished superpower. Then we'll look at the People's Mandate they got in 1906, the new liberal idea that took hold, the key architects of change, and finally, how they started building the safety net.
Okay, first up, a tarnished superpower. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, the British Empire was, huge. It spanned the entire globe. But if you looked closer, back home, there was a serious crisis brewing just beneath the surface. A big wake-up call came from the Boer War over in South Africa. When the army tried to sign up recruits, they got a massive shock. A huge number of the men, especially from the industrial cities, were just too unhealthy and malnourished to even be soldiers. This set off all these alarm bells about what they called national efficiency. The thinking was, if our people are this unfit, how are we ever going to compete on the world stage?
And this wasn't just some military concern. It was a deep-seated crisis of poverty. In fact, David Lloyd George, who'd soon be a major player, claimed that a staggering 10 million people were living without the bare necessities. And he wasn't just making that up. Investigators like Charles Booth and Seabourn Rowntree were doing these groundbreaking surveys that showed, with cold, hard data, that nearly a third of the people in some cities were living in abject poverty.
And these weren't just statistics in a report. This was the visible, everyday reality for millions. In the big industrial cities, life was just a constant, grinding struggle. The sight of hungry kids with no shoes, that was just normal.
To make matters even worse, Britain's time as the world's undisputed industrial champ was coming to an end. For decades, it had been the workshop of the world, but now you had these incredibly dynamic new economies, Germany and the United States, catching up, and fast. The balance was shifting. Britain was starting to buy more from them than it was selling to them. The pressure was really on.
So all these anxieties about poverty, about the nation's health, about the economy, they all came to a head in the 1906 general election. And the whole thing was fought over one huge, explosive issue. This was the Great Debate. A leading conservative, Joseph Chamberlain, was pushing something called tariff reform. His idea was to tax goods coming into Britain to protect British jobs. But the Liberals seized on this. They became the champions of free trade, and their message was simple and powerful. Chamberlain's tariffs will make your food more expensive. It was a bread-and-butter issue, literally. And the result? Whoa, it was a political earthquake. The Liberals won by a massive landslide, one of the biggest in British history. You can see the numbers right there. The public had totally rejected tariff reform and given the Liberals this incredible mandate to govern. The stage was set.
Now, with this huge victory, a new and pretty radical way of thinking that had been bubbling under the surface suddenly exploded into the mainstream of the Liberal Party. It was an idea that was about to redefine what government was even for.
They called it New Liberalism. And what it did was completely reframe the whole idea of freedom. See, the old idea was freedom from the state. But New Liberalism argued that you can't really be free if you're trapped by poverty or hunger or the fear of getting sick. So the state actually had a responsibility to step in and secure that freedom for people. And the contrast here is just so stark, isn't it? Old liberalism was all about self-help and keeping government out of your business. But new liberalism, it was all about collective responsibility, about creating safety nets. It argued that in this new, complex industrial world, the state had to step in and guarantee a minimum standard of living for everybody.
This thinking was really pushed forward by intellectuals like J.A. Hobson. He basically argued that individual freedom is great, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. For people to actually reach their potential, society, acting through the government, had to make sure everyone had a basic level of social welfare. It was a huge shift in thinking.
Of course, an idea is just an idea without powerful people to make it happen. And this new liberal government, well, it had a real dream team of reformers ready to go.
So you start with the Prime Minister, Campbell Bannerman. He sees that huge election win and says, "Yep, this is our green light for social reform." When he steps down in 1908, his successor, Herbert Asquith, makes a genius move. He promotes the two most energetic radicals in the party. David Lloyd George becomes chancellor, and a young, ambitious Winston Churchill gets a big job at the Board of Trade. And that pair, Lloyd George and Churchill, became the absolute engine of reform.
And this team absolutely did not mess around. Between 1908 and 1911, they just unleashed this wave of new laws that started to build the very first foundations of a national welfare state. They were putting their new philosophy into act. I mean, just look at this burst of activity. They started with old age pensions in 1908, a total lifeline to keep elderly people from having to go to the dreaded workhouse. Then, in 1909, they passed the Trade Boards Act to set the first ever minimum wages in those horrible, exploitative, sweated industries. And then came the big one, the National Insurance Act in 1911, a massive state-run plan to support workers if they got sick or lost their jobs.
And how did they pay for it all? Lloyd George introduced his famous People's Budget in 1909. It hiked up taxes on the rich to fund all these new welfare programs. And he didn't sell it as some dry economic plan. He sold it as a crusade. He called it a war budget to wage implacable warfare against poverty and squalidness. It was incredibly powerful rhetoric.
So, the crucial point, the main takeaway here, is that these reforms set a brand new precedent in British politics. They established the principle that the state has a direct responsibility for the well-being of its people. That idea permanently changed the relationship between the government and its citizens, which leaves us with one final fascinating question. What was really driving all this? Was it a genuine change of heart, a moral revolution born out of compassion? Or was it a really smart political calculation? Remember, the new Labour Party was on the rise, and there was a real fear of socialism. You could argue the liberals were just trying to prove that capitalism could be compassionate, to kill socialism with kindness, if you will. The truth? It's probably a mix of both. But whatever the motive, Britain was changed forever.